All right, welcome. Today we're going to crack open Canada's constitutional toolbox and take a look at one of the most powerful and honestly most fascinating tools inside, judicial review. You hear about it all the time, right? It's a huge part of our democracy. But how does it actually work? Let's get into it.
So let's start with a really basic question. In any democracy, who makes sure the government plays by its own rules? I mean, we elect them to make laws, but what if those laws go too far? What if they break the fundamental rules our country is built on? Who's the referee? Well, that's where the courts come in.
And this right here is the reason why. This is the blueprint. Section 52(1) of our Constitution Act couldn't be clearer. It says the Constitution is the supreme, #1 law of the land, period. And any other law that doesn't line up with it, it's basically void. This one sentence, it's the entire foundation for judicial review in Canada. This whole idea has a name: constitutional supremacy. Think of it like this. If running a country is a game, the Constitution is the official rulebook. And constitutional supremacy is what gives our courts the power to be the referees, to blow the whistle when a law or a player goes out of bounds.
Okay, so let's check out the first major tool in that toolbox. I like to think of this one as a level and a square, kind of like what a carpenter uses. Its whole job is to make sure the government is built properly and that each level of government, federal and provincial, is staying in its own lane. So this is what we call judicial review on federalism grounds. You know how in Canada, power is split between the federal government in Ottawa and the provinces? Well, this type of review asks a really straightforward question. Did the government that made this law actually have the authority to make it? It's all about who's in charge of what.
So, how do the courts figure this out? Well, they use this really cool legal idea called pith and substance. Basically, it means they don't just read the title of a law and call it a day. No way. They dig deep to find its true purpose and what it really does. They'll look at things like parliamentary debates to figure out the law's purpose, and then they'll analyze its real-world effects. It's kind of like being a detective, right? It stops a government from just slapping a misleading label on a law to sneak it into an area where they don't have power.
All right, let's grab our second tool from the box. This one isn't about the structure of government. It's more like a magnifying glass. Its job isn't to check who made the law, but to zoom right in and see how that law affects the fundamental rights and freedoms of every single one of us.
And this, of course, is a charter challenge. This is when a court looks at a law to see if it violates the rights we're all guaranteed in the charter. You know, things like freedom of speech, equality rights, or the right to life, liberty, and security. This is where judicial review becomes very, very personal.
Okay, so this is super important to get straight. On one hand, you've got federalism review. That's all about jurisdiction. The question is simple. Did the right level of government make this law? It's about authority. But then, on the other hand, you have charter review. This one is all about rights. It asks, does this law mess with a person's fundamental freedoms? A government could be perfectly within its authority to pass a law, but if that law stomps on your charter rights, it can still be tossed out.
So how does the charter review actually play out in court? It's basically a two-step dance. First, the court asks a simple question. Does this law actually limit a charter right? If the answer is no, well, that's the end of it. But if the answer is yes, we go to step 2. And that's when the tables turn, and the government has to prove that its limit on your rights is actually reasonable and justified in a society like ours.
Now, a lot of people think that when a court strikes down a law, that's the end of the story. Game over. But that's not really how it works. In reality, a court's decision often just kicks off a conversation, a kind of back and forth between the judges and the politicians. This idea is called dialogue theory. And the theory is that the courts don't necessarily get the final say. They just get a very important say. They're the ones who flag a problem, point out where a law doesn't meet our country's standards. Then the ball is back in the legislature's court to go back to the drawing board and try to write a better law, one that still does what they wanted to do, but without violating our rights. It's more of a collaboration than a fight.
Here's a textbook example. In a famous case called Ford v. Quebec, the Supreme Court said that completely banning English on commercial signs was a violation of freedom of expression. So what did Quebec do? They didn't just throw up their hands. They went back and passed a new law that said, okay, French has to be the main predominant language on signs, but you can have other languages too. See? That's the dialogue in action.
Of course, this whole system brings up a really big, juicy question for our democracy. Is it right that a handful of non-elected judges can strike down a law passed by the people we all voted for? This is sometimes called the counter-majoritarian problem. Now, people who support it say it's an absolutely essential safeguard. It protects minorities from what's sometimes called the tyranny of the majority.
but it's a debate that's at the very heart of how our democracy works.
So for our last point, it's really important to know that this whole structure, this whole idea of judicial review, isn't just held up by the words written down in the Constitution. There's also this powerful, invisible foundation made up of core principles.
And these are the big ones. The rule of law, which means nobody is above the law, not even the government. Judicial independence, which makes sure judges can make tough calls without worrying about political blowback. And the separation of powers, which keeps the different branches of government in their own lanes. Without these ideas, the whole system of judicial review would just fall apart.
But here's the key thing to remember about these principles. The Supreme Court has made it clear that while they are absolutely part of our Constitution, they're more like guides. They help the courts figure out what the written words of the Constitution actually mean. They can't, on their own, be used as the sole reason to strike down a law.
Which brings us right back to the central debate, doesn't it? Is judicial review the ultimate democratic safeguard protecting the rights of all of us from the power of the majority? Or is it an undemocratic check on the people we elect to represent us? The truth, as always, is probably somewhere in that complicated, ongoing conversation that continues to shape Canada.